it's Mike Kaye, Panthers beat reporter for the Charlotte Observer. I'm joined by Alex Zietlow, fellow Panthers beat reporter for the Charlotte Observer. And guess what? This is another episode of the Processing Blue podcast.
Wait, Mike, real quick, did you intentionally mispronounce my last name?
No, but I did want to make sure that you were paying attention because we've willed ourselves through the heat of a training camp.
It's true.
So tell them how you actually pronounce your last name.
Zietlow, as in the I is silent for some reason. Ask my ancestors about that.
Well, I am not silent, and that's why I'm doing the hosting of this podcast. If you haven't already turned this off, the Panthers are about to enter the second week of the preseason. They're going to host the Jets for joint practices on Thursday. Alex is going to earnestly write a feature on at least two players during the week.
Earnestly.
Earnest is the key word. If this was Sesame Street, earnest would be the word of the day. I introduced myself as the less earnest Panthers beat writer.
That's a true story.
Yes, as a joke. That is my sense of humor. Because sarcasm is key, and you got to commit to the bit. But anyway, as Zach, our producer, always says, Mike, stop talking. So let's get into this because we've now seen a preseason game of action, sans starters. We've seen some practices. I know you had a personal event that you had to cover and work through, and so I was working this weekend solo. Bryce Young, in my opinion, had his best back-to-back practices of his entire career from a training camp standpoint. Today we were both out of practice. That was kind of like a shortened practice where they did like one session. I almost said episode. One session of competitive padded drills where the defense kind of owned it.
You made a joke during the practice where like defense dominated and Dave was like, "All right, time to go to install."
Yeah, I mean it was a tough beat. I mean there was a huddle and everything. The defense was like hosting what looked like a
dance party.
Yeah, it was like a quinceañera. Like people were like dancing around. Like I mean, it was wild. I was like,
there were two interceptions, both by Damani Richardson.
The undrafted rookie. How about that?
Yeah, so they had plenty to celebrate about.
But Alex, you have put together a rundown that I think is close to flawless, and it's only not flawless because I'll probably ramble at some point in this time. But what do you got for me today?
Well, okay, so the first thing that I want us to hit on is this is the first time that we're talking since that preseason game between the Panthers and the Patriots, where we both watched and we both kind of looked at each other and said, man, this resembles 2023, doesn't it? Of course, like you mentioned, 33 players didn't suit up at all. Among them, Bryce Young, which we talked about a lot last week, and I think we should rehash again this week. But let's start with that. I'm going to start with my first takeaway from the preseason game, and I'll hand it off to you. So, and because I get to go first, I get to be optimist Alex, and I get to be earnest Alex. I'm going to focus on how the pass coverage of Ejiro Evero's defense shines again. We know that Evero is this guy, this defensive coordinator who's known for focusing on stopping the run and has developed a scheme that is conducive to that. His 3-4 scheme is known for that. That said, the pass coverage held up really well yesterday. Deshaun Jameson had a really good game, had 2 pass breakups. He got beat once on the sidelines where he kind of slipped as the quarterback threw a jump ball. He slipped and he didn't quite get there. That led to a big gain, but whatever. That was a blemish on a really good day for him. Lamar Jackson, not that Lamar Jackson, but Lamar Jackson in the secondary really showed out as well. Alex Cook led the team in tackles. So a lot of players in the secondary really shined, even as J.C. Horn was out, even as Dane Jackson was out. And also the pass rush surprisingly held up too. I mean, the Patriots, it's well known across the league, the Patriots' offensive lines is a bit of a concern. It's a little bit of some decisions will have to be made over on that side. But Eku Leota had a day in the backfield. He had 3 straight plays where he was wreaking havoc in the backfield, and he was doing his Frankie Louva impression after those tackles for losses. He made an S with his arms outstretched and let out a cathartic scream. Obviously showing homage to Samoa, which is where he's from. I was just really impressed with this defense, and particularly the defensive backfield, because that was a question mark coming into this year. Particularly the depth of it was a question mark coming into this year. And they held up pretty good against the Patriots, who, by the way, did not rest their starters. Obviously, the starters didn't play that much. But, Mike, okay, so that's mine. What's your takeaway?
Well, I think I'm going to handle the opposite side of the ball because, well, you know me, I like to dwell on the negative. I don't like to dwell on the negative, but what I would say is I think, the wide receivers got a lot of buzz those first 2 weeks. Jonathan Mingo and Terrace Marshall and obviously we've seen Taylor Moton kind of sidelined at right tackle and Jadeveon Clowney just having his way with Badera Torre, who gave up 2 sacks before suffering a knee injury.
Also, by the way, are you proud of me for not mentioning Jadeveon Clowney?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think that was
he
kind
didn't play, but...
I think that was kind of why I was just like... I thought you were going to be, like, in a mythical world. But yes, I am proud of you, always. But I think, looking at the depth of the offense, it's not that great. I mean, Mingo drops a pass that he should have made. It was difficult. The Terrace Marshall drop to start the game was just brutal. You've got to make that catch. And, at some point, the sand is going to run out at the hourglass for Terrace Marshall here. He's been passed over by Matt Rule. Steve Wilkes played him a little bit more. Passed over by Frank Reich. Yep. Then passed over by Chris Tabor. Now he's with his 5th either head coach or interim head coach in... less than 4 full years, and it's just at some point something has to click. And I just feel like whenever I watch him with pads on, he's a different player than when pads are off and he's cutting through the defense. That kind of showed up. Ricky Lee and Badera Ore, hopefully I'm pronouncing that properly, they switched sides throughout the first half. Ricky Lee struggled mightily from the right side, gave up a sack, had a holding penalty. Torre was just terrible on both sides, and then had a knee injury. They went into the game with just 7 offensive linemen, which is a problem. Obviously, Nash Jensen, congratulations to him. He had a baby over the last week, and so he missed the preseason game. Totally reasonable absence, obviously. But when you're not going to start your starters, you're going to be shorthanded. Going in with 8 probably wasn't even enough. And they just, Brady Christensen, there's no reason why Brady Christensen should be playing into the 4th quarter of a game.
Well, that's something that we were texting about during the game. The fact that Brady Christensen is in the game right now is not a good look.
Yeah, it's just, it's not. It's not it's not necessarily a criticism of him. It's just a poor asset allocation, also planning, right? Look, this team has had 14 or 15 injuries, and it's not easy. Look, you think that a 90-man roster is huge. It's really not when you're trying to get in multiple reps for multiple guys, and then you're sitting 33 dudes. I mean, that's one guy for every point of Tracy McGrady in his prime season. You know what I mean? That's a lot. That's a lot, kids. And so I think from there, the offensive depth is concerning. Because you've got guys like Taylor Moton, you've got guys like Xavier Legette, who's coming off a foot injury. You've got Jonathan Mingo, who had some injury history coming into the NFL and had to miss some time last year, and who, by the way, has not been super consistent based on his rookie season. He's having a decent summer, or a strong summer, I should say. And then you got Terrace Marshall. So I think, outside of running back, this team doesn't have really great depth on offense.
Yep. Doesn't have great depth on offense, and that's a question that I kind of want to bring up to you. And we should rehash the Bryce Young thing. Will he play this week? Should he play in the rest of the preseason in a second? But I want your take on this. Should we see 33 guys out again?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
This team was not good enough last year. I made this point, I think on the podcast last week. I think they should play in the preseason. I don't think it's a big deal if they miss preseason game 1, or even if they really miss preseason game 2. But if the plan is to get them if the plan is to get them preseason work in game 3, right? they're going to have a joint practice with the Jets. There's no reason why they have to play the Jets in a game-like setting, I guess. In theory, they should have more depth, and they should have guys who should play that didn't.
Right.
But I think from like a full onslaught of your everybody's around sort of thing, I think Game 3 has to be the mark in Buffalo. This team was 2-15, and I understand that they're like over 40 new players. This team was not good enough last year when they did play in the preseason, let alone you're going to have a bunch of guys come like just fresh off the practice field into a game in week 1. I just don't think that that's a recipe for success. I understand the injury risk, but there's an injury risk in practice, as we've seen. Right. There's a major injury risk in joint practices. That's part of the reason why they're only doing one joint practice around the league for the most part, as opposed to 2, because by the second time, guys are fighting and doing all this other stuff. So what I would say is, not even just speaking about Bryce Young, there are so many guys that need these live reps. And truthfully, and I said this in our exclusive newsletter that you guys can sign up for on charlotteobserver.com, a wonderful website. The thought process of these joint practices is really important, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But they need to see a different defense. They have seen, specifically Bryce Young and Chuba Hubbard and most of the guys on the offensive line and the tight ends, they've been around. They have seen this defense more than Bugs Bunny saw Daffy Duck in the 1990s. It is a thing. And I just think, that can be detrimental in a couple of ways, right? You get too used to playing and having success against one group, or you can become stagnant, and that's the only type of defense you can perform against. And so I think the Jets will be a great test. They're more of a 4-3 base. But I think facing a team like the Bills, which has a different system, makes a lot of sense too.
Well, I think it's fascinating you bring this up because when I was growing up and watching the NFL, the first game of the preseason, back when it was a 4-game preseason, the first game of the preseason was when you played your starters the most. And then you pared down their playing time afterward. I remember my dad was a big Green Bay Packers fan, and by Aaron Rodgers' third year, he would throw one pass in the final game of the preseason, and he would try to go deep every time so he could just only throw one pass, score a touchdown, and then be done for the rest of the day. And now it's it seems like that formula is shifting. You're suggesting that the Panthers might be best suited to play their starters most right before week 1, which I find fascinating.
Well, I think it's getting all your horses to the race, right? You want to make sure that you have all your main talent there. And I think there's logic in saying, hey, let's get to game 3. Because you want to make sure all the guys get the reps that they possibly can in practice so you can install what you need to. Well, guess what? Training camp's over on Thursday.
Yeah.
And so then it becomes a normal practice week, and you get into routines, and guys are typically off Tuesdays, and, you can plan a little bit more strategically. You're not around fans, and there's no cell phones and all that sort of stuff. I just kind of think, from their standpoint, as a first-year play caller, or a first-year head coach who's also going to be a play caller in his second year, you'd want to kind of, see what you got.
Like you said, Alex made his return today, just like Tommy Tremble and just like Shaq Thompson, in good company there. So you mentioned that Bryce had a really good weekend. Is there anything that suggests, you kind of hinted at it, but I do want you to go a little bit deeper on this, Mike. Is there anything to suggest that in the past 3 days suggests that Bryce shouldn't play at all in the rest of the preseason? Or is he lumped in with the other 33 guys? Yeah, he deserves reps. He needs reps.
So I'm a big believer in practice.
Yeah.
And even then, I think he should play in the preseason. I think he hasn't had to play with the fear of actually being hit. And I feel like that's a completely different... You know what I mean? If you're... Take this analogy for what it's worth. If you're learning how to drive, and you're driving around a parking lot, and that's the only thing you know, when you get your license and you actually go out on the road, how prepared are you? Now, obviously, Bryce Young's played in the SEC. He was awesome at Alabama. But playing quarterback isn't like riding a bike, I would assume. There are some pitfalls and some, you know what I mean? Like, he just hasn't had to be hit since mid-January. And I think, you're also, like I said earlier, used to seeing the same defense over and over and over again. And as exotic as the coverages are in Evero's defense, like, the reality is people have different concoctions and different recipes for how they want to get to the quarterback, how they want to disrupt the quarterback, how they want to cover the wide receivers, etc.
Yeah.
And I think Dave Canales, there's a little bit of, like, not imposter syndrome internally, but from the outside looking in, it's kind of like, can he do all these roles? He's the head coach, the offensive coordinator, the quarterback's coach, essentially, the spirit leader. Like, he is Jordan Matthews,
motivator. Yep.
Yeah, Jordan Matthews even said it. And so I think that's a lot to put on one person, especially in their first year as a head coach. And so I'm intrigued to see what he can do from that standpoint with, the apple of his eye in this offense in Bryce Young.
Yeah. I largely agree with you, Mike. I comprehensively agree with you. Patrick Mahomes is playing. Josh Allen's playing. Jalen Hurts didn't play, but he suited up. He was wearing pads. Like,
and he'll probably play.
And he'll probably play. Yeah. So, I mean, you can find examples littered around the NFL to support or deny or whatever. But if Patrick Mahomes, I mean, I don't know. If the dude in Kansas City is playing, my initial idea is you should probably figure out what the Chiefs are doing.
And if you're doing this to prevent injury, well, what do you think's going to happen when he steps on the field week one? Like, I mean, it's one of those things. Like, I just, at some point, you're either afraid to play him or you're just being overly cautious. And I don't think either one of those things actually helps him.
Yeah. All right, let's move on. I think the listeners of this podcast know how we feel about that, but it's the biggest story in Panthers camp right now. So, next biggest story is the Jets joint practice, and Mike, I want to discuss what each of us are going to kind of look for. We've devised a plan as to how we're going to attack Jets joint practice. Last year, my first training camp, you were like, Alex, cover every single thing Bryce Young does. If he chews a piece of gum, tell me what flavor it is, type of thing. And this year, we're going to do an inverse. You're going to cover the Panthers offense. I'm going to cover the Panthers defense and how it holds up against Aaron Rodgers, who I've heard is a good quarterback and let's just leave it at that. He's a man of many trades.
He says things.
So, all right, let me just quickly go over what I'm looking for at this Jets joint practice, and I'll be looking at the defense. I mentioned it in the opening segment. I'm interested to see how the secondary holds up. Like you mentioned, this isn't the Panthers wide receiver room that they'll be going up against. Aaron Rodgers is a different quarterback than Bryce Young is. You got Garrett Wilson that he's throwing to. You got Mike Williams that he's throwing to. You got Xavier Gibson that he's throwing to. You got Alan Lazard, who is this like veteran guy who he knows Aaron quite well. This is going to be a challenge for him.
It's so weird to hear you say Alan Lazard is a veteran guy, because I covered his rookie training camp in Jacksonville, and it was one of the worst training camp performances I've ever seen in my life. So the fact that he is still in the league and is a veteran is wild.
Well, I mean,
speaks to Aaron Rodgers.
Well, I mean, check the depth chart, bro.
Yeah.
But you got J.C. Horn, who's healthy, who seems happy. He's looking good. He will most certainly play in this joint practice. You got Dane Jackson, who is this guy that Dan Morgan certainly believes in. On the other side of J.C., you got Troy Hill, who is the nickel, who is the veteran. And then you got three safeties who Evero basically said three of them could start.
Sure.
And in his system, only two play on the field at the same time, but all three could start. I'm just interested to see how that'll do. I'm interested to see how the pass rush goes. Jadeveon Clowney, you're not going to see a full pass rush. You're not going to see it at full strength because obviously DJ Wanham's still hurt. Obviously Amari Barno's still wearing shorts as opposed to football pants. But
football pants, Zach.
Excuse me?
Nothing. Go ahead.
But seeing the pass rush at its fullest strength at the moment will be interesting. But again, guys, I mean, I know you're probably like, Alex, you're not really saying anything interesting. Like, tell us what exactly we should look for, and then tell us how that's going to translate into the game, and then tell us how many wins the Panthers are going to have, and then tell us all this. I mean, it is a practice.
That is a really long conversation to have with the podcast that only isn't listening.
No, well, the point is like, give us all the answers immediately. There aren't going to be their answers aren't going to be provided after this joint practice, but we'll get a little glimpse. I think the more compelling thing is on offense, and that's what you'll be looking at. What are some things that you'll be searching for?
Well, I don't want you to sell yourself short, because best friends on opposite sides of the ball, Nathaniel Hackett, the offensive coordinator for the Jets, and Idro Evero for the Panthers, they were together in Denver when Hackett was the head coach. But they go back a long ways. They are extremely tight friends. I'm interested to see how they interact on the field. But when you bring up the offense versus the defense, Robert Saleh obviously is known for having a great defense. Ulrich, I believe, is the defensive coordinator. He's done a really good job. He's going to be a head coaching candidate. And then, I think Canales is still kind of I don't want to say a conundrum, but like a mystery in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So, look, I don't think the offense is like super like this spectacular artistic thing, but I do think he's got cheat sheets for the quarterback. I'm interested to see how Bryce Young fares against a different secondary. They have two really good corners. Obviously, Deontay Johnson versus Sauce Gardner is going to be really fun to watch. I'm also interested to see how the running backs do against C.J. Mosley and their linebackers. They've got a pass rush. Even with Haason Reddick, who we'll talk about later, holding out, essentially. I mean, Jermaine Johnson is from FSU, is a really good player. Will McDonald, who the Panthers loved last year. He got a little bit overdrafted, but I think he's kind of coming into his own. And they got good safety play. So, I think this is a complete defense they're going to get to go against. I mean, I know Aaron Rodgers getting injured last year kind of sank their season, but this defense is formidable, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see how the new toys on offense kind of work in rhythm with Bryce Young against them.
Yeah, and I did want you to mention this. As much as I said that not too much can be discerned from this, and that it's a joint practice isn't the end all be all, it's not the most consequential thing. Mike, you have said that last year you had the team at a certain amount of wins, and then after every training camp practice they deducted a little bit, and then after the Jets practice they deducted more. Is that still the case this year? Do you think that this could be an indicator to the point of, this team is a 5-win team or a 7-win? Like, how the Panthers perform against the Jets, does that have any bearing on how you think the win-loss record will shake out?
I think the side of the ball that you're covering is going to be a great indicator.
Okay.
If this defense can continue to make strides, especially against somebody like Aaron Rodgers and Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall and all these guys, I think they're in really good shape. I don't think this team is going to be a pass all over the field offense. I do think they're going to run the ball pretty consistently. This is probably going to be a thud practice. We haven't confirmed that yet. So it's going to be harder to kind of see what the running backs can do. That said, I do think, you can get a little bit of an indication. Like right now I have them at 6 wins at most. Could this practice drop my prediction? Maybe. Maybe that's not fair. But I will tell you, last year the hype was this Panthers team could win 12 games and run away with the division. And as I watched training camp, I was like 11, 10, 9, 8. You know what I mean? Like it just, and I think I had them at 8 and 9 when we turned in our predictions, but yes. I think in my brain, in the back of my head, I was like 7 and 10. 7 and 10.
Yeah.
And so even then, that was apparently a little too overzealous. So we'll see.
All right, like Mike mentioned, I did want to put him on the spot for a second. And when I say put him on the spot, yes, I did just say, hey, Mike, can you just kind of cook on Haason Reddick for a little bit?
Oh, I'd love to.
Just real quick, Haason Reddick has held out of Jets training camp since it began last month due to a contract dispute. and now he wants to be traded, according to reports. Haason Reddick is a guy who has a lot of interest in Carolina. He was a former formidable pass rusher in Carolina, opposite of Brian Burns. He's now rostered by the Jets. The Jets are coming to town on Thursday for that joint practice. The Jets general manager said, whoa, Haason's not getting traded. We've been aligned and consistent in our messaging to him and our expectations of him.
Some would say earnest.
Some might say that. Mike, what is there to make of this? I mean, the natural question to ask is there any possibility that the Panthers can bring back Haason Reddick? But I don't really want to ask that because I know the answer. But just cook. I'm going to give you the case.
You ready, Zach? Let's do this. So here's what I would say. Let me lay out some facts for you.
Nice.
The Panthers have the third worst cap allotment right now in the entire NFL at $6.1 million. Haason Reddick is sent to make $14.25 million on the final year of his deal. So you say to yourself, well, you could always negotiate a new contract before a trade. Well, he's about to turn 30 later this year. Typically, with players that are 30, you want to sign them to deals that are about 3 years. Not to get into inside baseball and the salary cap, but typically what teams do is you'll sign a huge signing bonus and then you'll spread it out throughout the contract so you can lower the cap number. Can't really do that here because if Haason Reddick doesn't agree to a trade beforehand, you have to be able to stash his $14.25 million deal, which is roughly $8 million more than what you have. Now, some people would say, well, why can't you readjust Taylor Moton's contract? He's in the final year of his deal. He's got a $29 million cap hit, whatever. Well, we've seen the way that they've used him in training camp where they've kind of tried to protect him, keep him healthy, use a lot of veteran days. He's about to turn 30 himself. Signing him to an extension, I feel like if they wanted to do that, they would have done that already. It's not really, you don't compound mistakes. You know what I mean? Like, okay, cool, I'm going to sign a guy who's about to be 30. We're a rebuilding team. Probably not going to make the playoffs. And then I'll sign another close to be 30-year-old for a market-setting money deal that he apparently wants. It's just not the way it works. It'd be very tough to pull off. It's possible. Don't get me wrong, it's possible, but then on top of that, you have to trade draft compensation. I believe the Jets sent a conditional 2026 third-round pick to the Eagles, if I'm not mistaken. You can look that up to tell me if I'm wrong or right. But here's what I would say. If you are trading for Haason Reddick, which I think is a nuclear contract right now, because not only has he stated that he wants a raise, he has shown you that he is not going to budge. He's taking on millions of dollars in fines for holding out with the Jets. He's now asked for a trade for the second time in 6 months. Like, that's a problem, right? So on top of that, you're trading for a guy that you have no leverage with because you already know he's just going to draw a line in the sand. So on top of that, if you just trade for the contract like the Jets did, which was moronic, objectively moronic and hilarious, then whether he said he would play on it or not, it's not good business. So that said, you're either negotiating against yourself or you're negotiating with no leverage. And so if you're negotiating against yourself, not only do you have to sign this guy to a more than 3-year deal so you can spread out the cap hit, because if you sign him to a 3-year deal, that's not a lot of landing room, right? I mean, you're just asking for more compounded problems. This team is not going to contend. Listen, in a vacuum, is Haason Reddick a really good player? Yeah, absolutely. But he's also a guy who's about to turn 30. He's more of a blitzing player off speed mismatches, similar to Frankie Louvu. He's a better player. He doesn't really play the run. And so you're looking at like a designated pass rusher who's about to turn 30, who's not a natural pass rusher and is more of a blitzer. Like, you're going to have to accommodate that player, not just financially, but scheme-wise. And do you really want to do that with the way Evero's scheme is operated? Plus, you've got Jadeveon Clowney, who has worked relatively well from the strong side.
Yeah. Well,
does that sound appealing? I mean,
for the lack of appeal of Carolina to go after him, as you beautifully laid out, you mentioned too, Panthers are rebuilding. How appealing is it for Haason Reddick to come to Carolina?
Exactly, and that's the other coin, right? Now, somebody could say, money talks. You know, he wants to get his bag while he can. I think part of the sell of the Jets was that, in theory, if Aaron Rodgers is around, they're a contender. Also, I would say that most teams that are contenders don't have cash right now. And yeah, you could say, hey, let's go for it. So like the 49ers, great, cool. Not that much of a scheme fit in my opinion. The Commanders, cool. Okay, you want to do that? Do it. The Lions, fine, whatever. So they have the cap space. But most of those teams want to look at a long-term future, and if there's a massive drop-off from Haason Reddick, you're paying money for years that you didn't get to actually take advantage of. And so I think that that's not necessarily the best business decision.
Yeah. Hey, I agree with all that. Mike, let's wrap up. If you're good with that. I mean, no, I'm not saying... No. Oh my gosh, that came out wrong. I more so meant you ready for the outro.
Sure, let's do it.
Okay. Thanks as always for listening to Processing Blue, our Carolina Panthers podcast. Please subscribe and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts by searching our name, Processing Blue. And if you watch us on YouTube, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click on that bell. Subscribe to the Charlotte Observer, charlotteobserver.com, who Mike Kaye says is a beautiful website, or a fantastic website. I forget the adjective.
It depends on the day.
And finally, stay humble, stay creative, and keep processing.
That's a wrap.